You know what? I can't get out of my head. About 2 years ago, I was helping clean out my great Aunt Dorothy's kitchen after she passed. She was 94 years old, lived alone in that same farmhouse in western Kentucky for 60-some years, and her pantry looked like a museum. Mason jars everywhere, labeled in pencil, stacked 3 deep. But the thing that stopped me was a tin canister sitting on the counter next to the stove. I opened it up, and inside was a bag of homemade breadcrumbs. Dry, golden, perfectly fine. And next to it, wrapped in a clean dish towel, was half a loaf of bread that had gone hard as a brick. She'd been saving it. Even at 94, even living alone, she was saving stale bread. Because that's what her mother did. And her mother before that. Now, I'd thrown away a bag of hamburger buns just that week. They'd gone stale, and I tossed them without thinking. But standing there in Dorothy's kitchen, I realized I'd probably thrown away hundreds of dollars worth of bread over the years. Bread that she would have turned into meals, cleaning supplies, and even home remedies. And here's the part that really got to me. The average American household throws away about a fifth of the bread it buys. At today's prices, that works out to roughly $80 to $120 a year just in wasted bread. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what she did with every stale slice, step by step, so you can start using these same methods in your own kitchen this week. And stick around to the end, because I'll share a trick involving stale bread and warm milk that you can use for everything from boils to splinters, and it actually works. Now, the first thing you need to know is that every older woman I've ever talked to about this did the same thing with stale bread. She made her own breadcrumbs. And I know that sounds simple, but the savings add up in a way that most people never bother to calculate. Here's what you do. You take bread that's gone hard, tear it, or cut it into rough chunks and let it dry out completely. You can leave the pieces on a baking sheet near your oven or spread them on your kitchen table overnight. Once they're bone dry and crumbly, you crush them. Before food processors existed, women would put the dried bread in a clean flour sack and go at it with a rolling pin. But you can pulse yours in a blender or food processor and get the same result in about 30 seconds. What you end up with is a canister of fine golden breadcrumbs that you can use for everything. Your meatloaf, your meatballs, your fried chicken coating, the crunchy top on your casserole, a thickener for your soups and gravies, a binder in your stuffing. Now here's where the math matters. A single canister of store-bought breadcrumbs runs you $3 to $5 today. Italian-style seasoned breadcrumbs cost even more. Panko breadcrumbs, which are really just a coarser grind, can run you $4 to $6 for a small container. But when you make your own, you control the seasoning. You can add dried herbs from your garden, a little garlic powder, some salt, a pinch of dried parsley. Custom breadcrumbs, zero cost, better flavor than anything on the shelf. If you cook regularly, you probably go through 2 to 3 canisters a year at minimum. That's $10 to $18 you're spending on something that is literally made from bread you threw away last Tuesday. You already paid for that bread. The breadcrumbs are sitting in your trash can right now. Now, this next one is something most people have heard of, but few people realize it was specifically designed to solve the stale bread problem. Bread pudding wasn't a recipe that happened to use old bread. It was built from the ground up as a way to rescue bread that had gone past its prime. The earliest versions go back to at least the 1000s in England, where cooks would soak stale bread in eggs, milk, and whatever sweetener they had, then bake it until set. But by the time the 1930s hit, bread pudding had become one of the most popular desserts in America precisely because the main ingredient cost you nothing. You take your stale bread, a couple of eggs, some milk, a spoonful of sugar, a splash of vanilla. That's it. And what you get is a warm, custardy dessert that your family will genuinely look forward to eating. Not a punishment for wasting bread, a reward for saving it. Now, the same principle applies to French toast, and here's what most people don't realize. Day-old bread makes dramatically better French toast than fresh bread. Fresh bread is too soft. It falls apart when you soak it in your egg mixture and turns mushy in the pan. But stale bread is drier and denser, which means it absorbs more of the egg and milk without disintegrating. It holds its shape on your griddle, develops a better crust, and has a more satisfying texture in the center. Every diner and restaurant kitchen in America uses day-old bread for their French toast. It's not a secret. It's just something home cooks forgot because we've all been trained to think stale means ruined. But our grandmothers knew the opposite was true. They kept a loaf aging on the counter specifically so your Sunday morning breakfast would turn out right. And then there was milk toast, a 1930s staple that most people under 60 have never even heard of. You take a slice of stale bread, brown it in butter in a skillet, pour warm milk over it, and eat it with a spoon. It costs you almost nothing. It's warm and filling, and it kept families fed through winters when the pantry was nearly bare. Here's one that goes back even further, and it shows you just how deeply the habit of saving stale bread runs through human history. Now, in Tuscany, Italy, peasant families developed 3 of the most famous dishes in Italian cooking, and all 3 were built entirely around stale bread. The first is panzanella, a bread salad that stretches back centuries to at least the 1300s. Tuscan peasants took old loaves of pane sciacco, the region's signature unsalted bread, soaked chunks of it in water or vinegar until softened, then tossed it with tomatoes, onions, basil, and olive oil. The poet Boccaccio likely referenced this dish in the 1300s, and 200 years later, a painter named Bronzino actually wrote a poem celebrating panzanella. A stale bread salad was considered worthy of poetry for over 700 years. You can make your own version tonight with whatever bread you have going stale on your counter. The second dish is ribollita, which literally means reboiled. You make a big pot of vegetable soup, and the next day you throw in chunks of your stale bread and reheat the whole thing. The bread absorbs the broth and breaks down into a thick, hearty stew that's more filling than the original soup. Now, some food historians trace ribollita all the way back to bread trenchers, those flat rounds of stale bread that served as edible plates in the Middle Ages. Servants would collect the sauce-soaked trenchers after a lord's feast and boil them together for their own meals. The third is papa al pomodoro, a thick tomato and bread soup that transforms rock-hard bread into something silky and rich. All 3 of these dishes belong to what Italians call cucina povera, resourceful peasant cooking. But here's what gets me. They weren't recipes born from creativity. They were born from necessity. and now they're served in high-end restaurants in Florence for $25 a plate. The same instinct to save your stale bread puts you in a culinary lineage that stretches back 700 years and spans from farmhouses to Tuscan villas. Now, this next one surprised me more than anything else on this list because it reveals how fundamentally different the kitchen was before the 1600s. Before that time, bread wasn't just food you ate, it was a cooking tool you used. Where you and I reach for a bag of flour to thicken a stew or a gravy, a cook in the 1300s would throw in yesterday's bread instead. The oldest surviving English cookbook, called Forme of Cury, was compiled for King Richard II around 1390. In it, there's a recipe called galantine that tells you to grind your bread crusts into a fine powder, mix them with spices and vinegar, and use the paste as a thick sauce for your meats and fish. Bread-thickened sauces were the standard across Europe for hundreds of years. Another recipe from 1420 for beef soup instructs you to soak a loaf of bread in broth and vinegar, push it through a strainer, and use the resulting slurry to thicken your simmering beef. That technique worked perfectly well for hundreds of years, but then a French cook named La Varenne came along. In the mid-1600s, he described how to make a roux, flour cooked in lard, as a thickening agent. The roux was smoother, faster, and easier to control than bread, and within a single lifetime, an entire continent of bread-thickened sauces essentially vanished. Almost. There's exactly one survivor. British bread sauce, a simple mixture of bread simmered in milk with onion and spices, is still served alongside roast turkey and chicken at Christmas dinners across England. It's been on the table continuously for over 600 years, making it one of the oldest surviving recipes in the English-speaking world. And you can make it in your own kitchen in about 20 minutes. Simmer your stale bread in milk with a halved onion, some cloves, butter, and a pinch of nutmeg. That's all there is to it. Czech families had their own version. They'd mix old breadcrumbs with beaten eggs to make dumplings for soup, or combine them with egg to make a filling omelet that stretched a single egg into a meal for two. Now, this next one is going to take you by surprise because it has nothing to do with your kitchen at all. Stale bread had an entire second career outside of cooking, and some of these uses lasted for hundreds of years. Here's the one that stopped me in my tracks. From 1612 to 1770, over 158 years, bread was the most popular eraser in the world. Before rubber erasers existed, artists and draftsmen would take a piece of stale bread, dampen it slightly, roll it into a ball, and use it to lift pencil and charcoal marks off paper. And it worked beautifully. The soft, slightly sticky texture of moist bread picks up graphite and charcoal without damaging the paper underneath. The rubber eraser wasn't even attached to a pencil until 1858, which means bread held the title of primary erasing tool for nearly 250 years. And it wasn't just artists. A 1908 issue of the Camera magazine describes bread as useful for lightening and erasing on photographic negatives. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Michelangelo himself used bread to clean the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel, pressing soft bread against the painted surface to lift away dust and grime without disturbing the pigment. English Heritage, the organization that maintains historic buildings across Britain, has confirmed that white bread rolled into a ball effectively lifts stains off wallpaper, painted walls, and kitchen cabinets. And you can use this in your own home today. But that's not all your stale bread can do for you. A slice of bread pressed gently against your floor after a glass breaks picks up the tiny invisible fragments that your broom misses. The soft surface captures shards that are too small to see, too small to sweep, and too dangerous to leave on your floor for your kids or your pets to step on. And bread swiped through your skillet after cooking absorbs grease before it hardens, keeping your drains clear and your cast iron clean. A single piece of stale bread can clean your wallpaper, pick up broken glass, and degrease your skillet, all in the same afternoon. And all of it for free, using something you would have otherwise thrown away. Now, here's one that most people have never heard of, and it connects stale bread to a folk remedy practice that stretches across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, the bread poultice. The older women in your family almost certainly knew this one. When someone in the family had a boil, an abscess, or a splinter that wouldn't come out, she'd take a piece of bread, soak it in hot milk until it was soft, squeeze out the excess liquid, and spread it directly over the affected area. She'd wrap it with a clean cloth and leave it for several hours, sometimes overnight. For boils and abscesses, the moist heat from the bread and milk mixture drew the infection to the surface and helped the boil come to a head on its own. For splinters, the warmth and moisture softened your skin while the poultice gently drew the foreign object toward the surface. Families across Ireland, England, Appalachia, and the American South used this remedy for as long as anyone can remember. Now, here's why it actually works. Moist heat increases blood flow to the affected area, which brings more white blood cells to fight infection. The warmth also softens tissue, making it easier for trapped material to work its way out. Modern wound care still uses moist heat therapy for exactly the same reasons. The women who used this didn't have the vocabulary for it, but she had the right idea, and a stale loaf of bread was her delivery system. No trip to the pharmacy, no expense at all, just bread, milk, and a clean cloth. You can try this yourself the next time you or your kids get a stubborn splinter. Soak a small piece of bread in warm milk. Press it over the splinter, wrap it with a bandage, and leave it on overnight. By morning, the splinter will have worked its way closer to the surface of your skin, making it much easier to remove. Now, here's a piece of history that you might find hard to believe, but it's well documented. During the Second World War, the British government actually made it illegal to sell fresh bread. The national loaf, as it was called, could not legally be sold until the day after it was baked, and the reason was pure wartime frugality. The government calculated that slightly stale bread could be sliced thinner than fresh bread, which meant more slices per loaf, which meant less bread wasted across an entire nation under rationing. Think about what that means for your own kitchen. An entire country's bread supply was deliberately made stale by law because the government understood that stale bread isn't wasted bread, it's bread that goes further. But the British Ministry of Food went even further than that. They printed instructional leaflets teaching families 4 specific ways to use their stale bread: baked crumbs for coating and topping, grated crumbs for binding and thickening, soaked bread for puddings and fillers, and leftover toast crumbled into soups and stews. Women's magazines ran competitions for the best stale bread recipes. The Victory Cookbook included instructions for stretching your meat by mixing 4 ounces of breadcrumbs into cooked mince and mashed potatoes. Now, those wartime families weren't just saving stale bread as a matter of habit. Their government was teaching them to do it as a matter of national survival. Rationing began in January 1940, and for the next 14 years, British families perfected the art of making every crumb count. And the bread they saved wasn't just going into breadcrumbs and puddings. It was being stirred into oatmeal brown betties, crumbled into vegetable hashes, and soaked into fillers that stretched a single pound of meat into meals for a family of 6. You can use every one of these same techniques in your kitchen today. Now, let me share a few patterns I've noticed since I started paying attention to how we treat bread today, because the contrast with how your family would have treated it 50 or 60 years ago is staggering. The first pattern is buying bread and expecting to throw part of it away. We've all been trained by expiration dates and plastic packaging to view bread as something with a ticking clock. The moment it feels slightly firm, into the trash it goes. But for most of human history, bread going stale wasn't the end of its usefulness. It was the beginning of its second act. Fresh bread was for eating. Stale bread was for cooking, cleaning, healing, and thickening. The second pattern is replacing homemade versions with store-bought ones and never questioning what that costs you. Breadcrumbs, croutons, bread pudding mix, stuffing in a box. Every one of these products is manufactured from stale bread. The factories are doing exactly what your family always did, buying cheap, stale bread and processing it into something they can sell you at a premium. You're paying someone else to do with bread what you could do yourself for free. The third pattern is treating bread waste as normal. Americans throw away 240 million slices of bread every year. Food waste has tripled in this country in just 50 years. We now waste more bread in a year than families consumed during the hardest times this country has ever seen. Take a look at your own kitchen trash can after your next grocery cycle, and you might be surprised by what you find in there. The fourth pattern is forgetting that bread was once too valuable to waste. For most of recorded history, bread wasn't a side item or a sandwich wrapper. It was the meal. Families ate their dinner off of it. Artists erased their drawings with it. Governments regulated the freshness of it. And families across every culture on earth built entire kitchen systems around never letting a single slice go to waste. Now, here's something I learned from an elderly woman in eastern Tennessee that I haven't seen written up in any cookbook, and it's one of those tricks that doubles as a surprisingly practical tip for your own kitchen. When bread goes truly stale, hard as a rock, past the point where even soaking would save it, you still don't throw it away. Here's what you do. You wrap it in a damp dish towel and set it in your oven at around 300 degrees for about 10 minutes. The steam from the damp towel penetrates the bread and softens it from the outside in. When you pull it out, it won't be fresh, but it'll be pliable enough to slice, toast, or cube for cooking. And if your bread is past even that stage, crumbly and dry all the way through, you grate it over a box grater straight into a jar. Those fine, dry crumbs keep indefinitely in a sealed container. You can build up jars of breadcrumbs over weeks and months, all from bread that most of us would have thrown away the day it went stiff. Your pantry can have more free cooking ingredients in it than your grocery cart has paid ones. And every single jar starts as a piece of bread that you decided was worth saving. That's the lesson I keep coming back to. Your family didn't save stale bread because they were behind the times. They saved it because they understood something we've all forgotten. Nothing that enters a kitchen should leave without serving a purpose. Not a crust, not a slice, not a crumb. They did it their whole lives, and the generations before them did it for just as long, and it works just as well today as it did 90 years ago. That's what I've learned about what stale bread is really worth when you stop treating it like trash and start treating it like an ingredient. Turn it into breadcrumbs and save yourself a lifetime of buying something you can make for free. Rescue it as bread pudding, French toast, or milk toast. Cook it into a Tuscan panzanella or ribollita and join a 700-year line of peasant genius. Use it to thicken your soups and gravies the way cooks did before flour existed. Clean your walls, pick up your broken glass, and degrease your pans. And remember that a bread poultice made from nothing but bread, milk, and a clean cloth can help you deal with boils and splinters without a trip to the pharmacy. These aren't quaint old habits. They're a complete system for making sure nothing in your kitchen goes to waste. And the people who practiced them were feeding their families on budgets that would make most of us panic. If any of this changed how you think about that half loaf going stale on your counter, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what your family did with stale bread, or which of these you're going to try first. And if you want more of these deep dives into forgotten kitchen wisdom that saves you real money, hit that subscribe button. I've got plenty more coming. Thanks for spending time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.